Welcome to our Halloween edition of Dornsife Dialogues. My undergraduate folklore course taught me that paying attention to the themes in movies, campfire stories, and other legends helps us to understand the cultural anxieties of the moment, and horror films in particular bring some of our deepest fears to the surface. Being an 80s kid, the movie that scared me the most was A Nightmare on Elm Street, with that iconic villain Freddy Krueger, who attacked teenagers in their dreams. I've since learned that the film's director, Wes Craven, was inspired in part by Germanic folklore and drew on the archetype of the boogeyman. Freddy first appears in the early 1980s, a time when conspiracy theories about satanic cults and infamous serial killers grabbed the headlines. But I suspect that the underlying theme of the powerlessness that kids and adults too often feel, of seeing the danger in the world but not being able to do anything about it, is what really got to me. While our anxieties change with the times, the popularity of horror movies remains. I'm looking forward to hearing what today's panelists have to say about it all, including why it is that we're so drawn to a genre designed to scare us out of our seats. Today's panel will be moderated by Karen Tongson. Professor Tongson chairs the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies and holds appointments in English and American Studies and Ethnicity at USC Dornsife. She is the author of 3 books, co-editor of an award-winning book series, Post-Millennial Pop, and co-hosts several podcasts. So I'll pass it off to Professor Tongson's capable hands, and she will introduce today's panelists. Thank you all for coming and enjoy the panel.
Thanks so much, Dean Miller, and we're delighted to all be here today to share in the spooky thrills of Halloween, as always, and it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists who have so many things to say about horror from so many different angles. First is Professor Leo Brody, my dear colleague, a professor of English at USC Dornsife and university professor, as well as the Leo S. Bing Chair in English and American Literature. He teaches 17th and 18th century English literature, film, history, and criticism, as well as courses on American culture, and he's published a range of books. But most relevant today, of course, is Haunted, on ghosts, witches, vampires, zombies, and other monsters of the natural and supernatural worlds. Another panelist here in the top, I guess that's the left-hand corner, is Professor Rebecca McKendry, who's an adjunct assistant professor at the USC School of Cinematic Arts, where she teaches directing, horror film history, and genre film production, which is very exciting. And her doctorate, so she spent her entire time cultivating her degree on horror media. And so I'm really excited to see what she brings to the discussion. She's also a writer and director of 4 feature horror films, and she previously worked on the business side of horror as an executive for production companies like Fangoria and Blumhouse. And last but certainly not least, is Anna Zlokovic, who is an award-winning writer and director whose work has screened internationally at numerous festivals, including the Sundance Film Festival and South by Southwest. In fact, some of you who are here may have even seen her debut feature film, Appendage, which was just released on Hulu this month. She was named one of IndieWire's 28 rising female filmmakers to watch in 2023. And of course, we're delighted to welcome her back here to USC, where she's an alumna of the School of Cinematic Arts, when she also holds a bachelor's degree in cinematic arts, film, and television production. So welcome, panel, welcome everyone, and just sort of following up on where Dean Miller left off and sharing the films that most scared her as an 80s kid. I have to say that the film that I think scared me most, in part because of my family's Catholicism and anything having kind of to do with like the intersection of religion and horror, was The Exorcist. And I'm wondering for each of you what that film was as well and why. Let's start with, go ahead, Rebecca.
I'll jump in. And I do think that a lot of kind of what scares us is based on our own personal backgrounds, because I don't want to say raised devoid of religion, but it definitely wasn't a thing in my parents were ex-hippies. Like, we just didn't have kind of a religious background in my house. It was very much kind of, believe what you want to believe type growing up. So I remember seeing The Exorcist. and it not having much of an effect on me. It was very much like, what's up with the girl tied up in the bed? Like, she's tied up in a bed. She's not doing anything. But like the cerebral cosmic horrors of kind of there's something bigger in the universe that you don't understand were the ones that always hit me the hardest. Like the first one that I remember having kind of a lingering lasting effect on me was Jacob's Ladder in the 90s, being one that like I was thinking I was probably in like 5th or 6th grade and thinking about it for days afterwards and deconstructing it. And yeah, it's one that I still find has a big impact on me.
Leo. Oops, I think you're muted. That is the greatest horror of Zoom, of course, as everyone knows.
Exactly, being muted all the time. I'm not exactly sure, you know. I mean, I've watched hundreds, who knows, thousands even of horror films and TV shows and things like that. And I don't know what really scares me about them. It's just going into these other worlds, you know, where the normal way in which we see things, the normal reality is just either turned upside down or non-existent. And that in fact, these kinds of spirits exist. I mean, actually, you know, the kinds that, in a certain way, that move me, let's say, rather than scare me. Something like the Nicole Kidman movie, The Others, say, which is a wonderful movie. And I also like, and in terms of more schlocky movies, I like Troll Hunter. You know, about the kids in the, you know, in the Scandinavia, somehow going around looking for trolls that still exist somewhere. So there's that mixture of a kind of reality and a kind of irreality that really is what attracts me to horror.
And Anna, as a creator of horror, I mean, I'm sure that you have many influences, but let's start with something that really scared the pants off of you when you were younger.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I don't know what this says about me and my history, but I would say in college, I started getting exposed to horror films. And the first one that kind of deeply spiritually disturbed me was Eraserhead. I consider that a horror film. And I was just like, what is happening? What is going on? Why is this little creature so scary? And, you know, I think it speaks to parenthood and so many things, but it opened up what movies could be and what horror movies could be for me. And I think it's stuck with me even today. I mean, I rewatch it now and I see a bit of humor in there, and I kind of am like, oh, this is a little more playful than I remember it. And maybe I've changed as a person, which is kind of cool. When you watch horror, you also grow with it. But when I was like 18 and watching that, I was like, I couldn't move for like a week, I think.
Well, you know, it's great that we all have so many cinematic touchstones across the ages, but you know, sort of as Dean Miller alluded to in her intro, obviously horror as a genre, as a form of expression, has existed for a very long time, and of course through not only folk cultures but literature. And Leo, as someone who studies horror at the intersection of literature and cinema, I'm wondering, you know, sort of what some of the origin points you would bring out for us are. I mean, for me, I know, of course, the famous story of the creation of Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, when she and Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley and a bunch of other writers were kind of gathered together trying to tell the scariest ghost story, which resulted in Frankenstein in 1818. But you know, what are some of the other kind of key touch points that like really made this genre rise in popularity?
Well, you know, horror literature certainly just basically, in a sense, wakes up in the late 18th century. And it's part of a whole kind of literature of that period that wants to excite emotion of one sort or another. There's pornography that in this period, you know, this exciting sexual feelings. There's horror, exciting feelings of fear. There's sentimental fiction, which wants to make you cry there. So it's a revolt against the kind of more rational, more narrative, straightforward literature, and trying to put in its place. I mean, you know, in part we call it romanticism or pre-romanticism as part of the period there, but wants to put in its place a literature that evokes emotion in the reader, that engages the reader in that way, rather than the reader just kind of sitting back and absorbing words there. But these words have power, and power to create feelings.
And even in the sort of cinematic history of horror, I think so many of us like think about or point to, everything from the 1970s onward, really. But in its very origins, cinema itself like comes from a place or a seat of horror that elicits emotions, right, Rebecca? Like you have all sorts of examples, I think, from the inception of cinema that bring this to us.
Yeah, and Leo definitely touched on this, that the kind of old saying is that as soon as man invented or we'll say as soon as a person invented the video camera, that the very first thing that we did with it was make a horror film and shoot a porn. And I'll also say, and the Lumiere brothers were like doing fun little videos, including cat videos. So we made cat videos as well, as you should. And but yeah, like even if we're looking at like some of the earliest stuff that was ever made, that was kind of the very first kind of fictionalized films, short though they be, we were looking at a lot of the speculative fiction that was coming out of the late 1800s. One of the very first examples of kind of what I'll call a horror film, or at least what I teach in my class as a horror film, was Edison, and he decided to recreate the beheading of Mary, Queen of Scots. And he's using like a locked off shot, and you see the blade fall, and then you see a fake head fall into a basket. So we're like getting gore films straight out. We see a lot of kind of Abraham Merritt and other speculative fictions kind of coming out right in those early years. There's an early version of Frankenstein that gets made. And a lot of this stuff is lost. We only have kind of record of it or bad footage of it, but it's all kind of, we're seeing the heavy horror trends of the late 1800s become the early film trends of the early 1900s.
That's incredible. That, again, just sort of the very first opportunity people are given to shoot video, to shoot moving images, that we have that pull, right?
Mm-hmm.
I guess as a creator then of film and of horror, Anna, I want to ask you, when did you first turn to the genre as a place where you wanted to create, where you wanted to be a cinematic artist?
Wow, that's a great question. I mean, I kind of, to piggyback off of what everyone is saying, I guess my personal origin story with the history of cinema and where I kind of grabbed onto it emotionally was with monster movies and monster stories, and this sort of idea of, I guess, feeling othered and like feeling like a monster yourself, but having humanity. And so I was really attracted to the Universal monster movies that first started coming out. Like we have, the Phantom of the Opera, Frankenstein, Dracula, all these sort of early movies, and Boris Karloff playing Frankenstein and adding so much humanity to, a monster that everyone is kind of like, get away from me. And you're like, no. So I think that's sort of where I, as a creator, kind of fall into that sort of pocket. And that interests me, continuing into making more monster movies, or even stories like The Exorcist, where, you see a young girl turn into a monster and suddenly it's like all your worst fears about what a child could be are in front of you. And I find that to be really fascinating and emotionally intense.
It's true. I mean, you mentioned Phantom of the Opera, which I've consumed in every possible form, from the Gaston Leroux novel to like the early films to, of course, the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, which as a member of the LGBTQ community, I've always said that like Phantom of the Opera was actually the musical was one of the things that most sort of resonated with me, even as I was coming to terms with my own identity. And each of you have brought out the fact that, the horror genre is so often a social means of coping with anxiety about strangeness, about otherness. And I just sort of wanted to invite each of you, and maybe I'll go back to Leo here for a moment, to just sort of talk about, an example where we're wrestling with, a major sort of social anxiety or historical or political anxiety through horror. Leo.
Well, it's really a fascinating question, and it's also a question of, to what extent the relationship of horrors in the outside world. What is that relationship? Horrors in the outside world to horror films or horror literature or something. That is horror literature, horror films a kind of purgative in some way? Does it allow, in the midst of, let's say, all sorts of, worldly tumult, wars, violence, and things like that, to be able to see a film is to see something with a beginning, middle, and end. That's something that is packageable, something that you might be scared, it comes out, but somehow it has a story, it has a narrative to it that's satisfying in that way. So you're scared, but at the same time, you're relieved also, I think, in one other way. So, I mean, again, there's, we've all been talking about it, Karen, you mentioned it too. It's like the way in which horror, certainly horror in its beginnings, is always about the other, about otherness, about Frankenstein or Dracula or Mr. Hyde or whoever it is. And to what extent that otherness is part of us, or to what extent it's out there somewhere. So, I mean, there are kinds of, if you look at, say, the 19th century, and the kind of beginnings of a mass economic civilization in England and the United States and, in Europe particularly there, where does the individual fit into that? Is the individual always going to be separate from that? So, I mean, all these kinds of horror stories explore that. And I think it's something that's still with us to the extent that, in fact, figures like Frankenstein or Dracula, are still appealing to audiences.
Yeah.
Yeah, Rebecca, you want to follow up with it?
Yeah. So completely going along with that. So you can actually track horror trends across all of film history in relation to what was happening in society. And there's usually a couple year gap, but you will always see horror films get incredibly violent after we've had some type of national trauma. Right after Vietnam War, we get some of the most violent horror films ever made. They also get postmodern, where they don't have an ending, where the characters have survived, but at what cost? Where everybody's just left insane at the end. And then we see it again right after 9/11, where that's where we have what we call our torture porn cycle, comes a couple of years after that. And so when you look at it, horror films function somewhat as a catharsis for people, where after we have been through something traumatic, we'll see this kind of echo chamber happen within the horror world. And even now, what we're seeing, the big question was, what are we going to see after the pandemic? Because everybody knew that this was something traumatic that was happening. Nobody really knew how to take it. And when I was doing consulting on where we would go, everybody kept saying, so are people just going to want comedies because everything was so serious? Like, are people still going to want to watch horror movie because our lives became a horror movie? And what we've actually seen come out is a trend called that is being termed liminal horror. And so, which I can talk about later, but it's this kind of these trends that happen. And then even on a personal level, I think that a lot of the times when you're looking at somebody's favorite horror film, it's because there's something in it that hit them at a very particular time. That's something that spoke to them at a very particular time in their life. A lot of it's going to be during our formative years of, I found this horror film as I was going through teendom and felt like the other. Or even just recently for me, right as we were realizing that we needed to have my son tested for autism, I watched The Babadook. And it was just one of these of seeing this mom battle what is considered to be normal with a child and realizing that her child is something else and that he's not communicating the way that she is. And it was so effective for me that it has, I sobbed after watching it, because it was just like staring at my life as told through coming to terms with the monster and kind of embracing it. And so yeah, like that is where I think a lot of our personal horror predilections come in, is something that scares us, but it allows us to come to terms with it on screen.
Yeah,
And I love, I'm going to bring you in just a second, Anna, because I wanted to at least flag the fact that both Leo and Rebecca talk about, horror itself as a kind of encounter with what's normal or in relation to the normal, and or desiring maybe some way of returning to normal after, these different eruptions and other kinds of, like really kind of difficult and wrenching realizations. But Anna, obviously I want you to answer this question, but I also wanted you to sort of revisit something that you said about empathy a little bit earlier, right? And that how, even as horror exposes us to the encounter with the other, or somebody who doesn't fit in, right? Or someone who kind of upsets the order of things, that one of the things that drew you to it was your own empathy, or like how it elicited that empathy. So I just sort of wanted to invite you in your answer to bring that back in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it kind of this all sort of reminds me of the importance of horror as, I don't know, a form or a space to grieve or to process things emotionally on an individual and a societal level. And I think empathy is a big part of that. You know, you see things that scare you and maybe about yourself in a horror film, and you're like, oh, well, I can't be the only one that's feeling this because this movie exists, and look how many fans it has, and look at all of us in this theater enjoying the film. And I think that that is very, very important. And I think helped me throughout my life as well. You know, I watch a movie like Raw, which is, you know, a movie about a cannibal college student. And I'm like, yes, I relate. You know, we all have, as we're discovering ourselves, you know, we're 18, 19, like you feel like, is this normal what I'm doing? Eating this person, you know, but like, am I normal? Am I not normal? Like, okay, well, you know, she's eating a person. Like, I kind of relate to that on like a freak level, but like after the movie's over, you're like, okay, like I feel like I've experienced something. I've put myself through something, and I've come out on the other side feeling a little more whole. And I think that's really cool.
You know, I would there's something connecting what Rebecca was talking about and Anna as well. And this whole question of the relationship of the horror film to what's happening outside the horror film in the rest of the world, that, you know, that creators of horror films, writers, directors, people like that, are sort of like antenna. You know, they're the early warning system for things as well, because, you know, when the film comes out, it's because it's been in production for what, 2 or 3 years before that in any case. So, you know, they're the ones who see it somehow through their own sensibilities, their own creativity. You know, what is going to bother people or in 2 or 3 more years, or, you know, as a trend.
Right. I was remembering, Rebecca, you mentioned something also that's happening, a trend right now of like grief porn.
Trauma porn, yeah, that we saw
yeah.
that I mean, I feel like Hereditary and Midsommar kind of were our first out of the gate, but then we saw a huge onslaught of trauma porn.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I feel like there's so much grief in the world right now. You're talking about, you know, post-pandemic, and there's so much pain and grief, and
Yeah.
there was like an antenna situation going on there as well, which is kind of interesting to think about.
Well, I'm wondering then, you know, I mean, we've been speaking kind of broadly about some of the things horror films do in general, but are there any specific films that you think have affected some kind of shift in our sense of, you know, either in our empathy for others, or that brought our attention to a cultural condition or ill or context that, you know, that kind of maybe changed the conversation in different ways? You know, sometimes it's not always, you know, in the most highfalutin forms that we come to a shift in our understanding of really consequential issues around our world. Do each of you have an example of a film that maybe does that, or that did that for you?
Yeah, I can give kind of a positive and a negative version of that. The negative of kind of how powerful a film can be in response to kind of our own psyche and fear. The biggest one's Jaws. I mean, where that impacted and is still impacting entire generations of people, to the point where there was a massive drop in beach attendance those summers after Jaws. You know, there were shark calls. Suddenly everybody was scared to death of this thing that we had been swimming next to for millennia. And so that's kind of the negative effect of how much, you know, if the film is well done, it can truly ingrain a fear, whether it's a just fear or not. It's a great film, absolutely great film. But even, you know, the filmmaker and the screenwriter and the novelist came out and were like, whoa there, this wasn't quite the intended effect that we were expecting. But then looking at like a positive level, I'll cite a movie like Jennifer's Body. Now, when Jennifer's Body came out, it was really critically panned. It didn't hit with fans, but a lot of people like me who had seen it when we were teens and into our 20s, suddenly, like a decade later, we're realizing just how important it was to us at the time, that it did have a lot to say about self-image, self-worth, about sexuality, about trying to figure out who you are. And that even if it did not hit right at the moment that it came out, that it had this kind of resonating effect within our psyche.
Yeah.
No, I would
And
say
I just saw Anna, so I'm assuming.
I was like,
Yeah. For Jennifer's Body.
Karen Kusama's a legend, in my opinion. Totally underrated, amazing director and writer.
Leo,
I would mention a film that no one would ever call a horror film, but it's sort of like a horror film in certain ways, and that's War Games. And the fear of AI. This is 40 plus years ago, almost. The film that comes out that in fact is so prescient about what kind of fears we have now there, and AI itself. We were talking before, and there's always, whenever a new technology appears, it's being used for horror effects, for horror reason. You have spirit photography, you have TV, it's in a film like Poltergeist, you have videotape in the Ring, things like that. And the idea, and why are these things mined in a way for horror or horror type effects? Because we don't know what they are as members of the audience. We don't know how they work there, and they could be turned against us. Terminator, films like that, same way, same kind of a new technology that we fear. I suppose it all goes back to Frankenstein, essentially. The idea that science is something to be feared in that way. And of course, now with so much anti-science in the world, and people who don't believe in science, it becomes a real national issue.
Yeah. It's interesting too, in this conversation, it made me think like Jaws was such an eventized thing. Like people were lining up around the corner to see that movie. And I feel like times have changed so much now. It's hard to get a movie into theaters. People are experiencing movies more individually on streamers. And I'm kind of curious to see how that affects shaping conversations. I mean, I guess things maybe move to the internet, but that sort of communal experience, I feel like, is so important in that. And I feel like the last time I had that with a very influential horror film like that was Get Out. I remember people being like, oh my God, like screaming in the theater, freaking out, like packed to the brim. And so it's interesting to consider in the future how that might shift or change, or just interesting to think about.
Yeah, Get Out. I mean, one of the basic movements in the history of horror is from the horror, the monster, whoever it is out there, in another country, and Dracula has to come from Eastern Europe to England, things like that. And gradually it gets to become closer and closer to home, and more. I mean, something like Get Out. It's a domestic horror in a certain way.
The call is coming from inside the house.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And you're sitting there on your couch watching a streaming show. I mean, there you are in the same way. The only time I ever had an experience like that was actually to see when I saw Dawn of the Dead, and I had no idea what it was about, but I saw it in a shopping mall, like the shopping mall in Dawn of the Dead, and we came out of the movies, and there were, and all the stores were closed, and it was totally empty in the same way. So that kind of, my own experience and the experience of the film somehow melded together.
I'm a huge fan of streaming. Like, I love attending theatrical movies, but I pick and choose which ones I go to. And I actually find streaming films for myself to be a lot more terrifying, honestly, a lot of the time, because it is me alone on my couch, often after my kids have gone to bed, watching something. And I feel so much more alone watching stuff like that than I ever would in a theater. And so if it's something like a Five Nights at Freddy's, where it's a bigger spectacle film, I'll always try to make it to the theater. But a lot of the smaller stuff that I find terrifies the crap out of me. I've even films that I've watched both ways. There's a new one, Argentinian film that just came to Shudder called When Evil Lurks. By far one of the most gruesome, brutal horror films I've seen in a long time. It's amazing. I saw it both on my TV by myself and then again in the theater, and I swear it was scarier by myself. And so, yeah, I'm a big fan of streaming films. I think that it also kind of levels the playing field of horror. Like going to see a horror film, and it's much like VHS did, where, going to see a horror film in a theater is a bit more of a commitment than clicking a button on Netflix. Just as you might not have gone to see, I Dismember Mama in a theater, but if you're just renting the VHS tape, it becomes lower stakes and we get an increase in horror fans.
We're just about to address some audience questions in a moment, but Anna, I wanted to give you a chance to also just kind of chime in here a little bit as someone who just had a film come out on a streaming platform. I just wanted a little insight into your process, because we've been talking about all of these things that go into how horror is received, but what goes into how it's made, or what were you kind of thinking about when you were making this film, and the effect you wanted it to have, and maybe even in thinking about the audience response you would want for it as it's streaming to all of us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's so crazy to try to make a movie. It's so hard. It's hard to get something greenlit. You work on things for years and they don't get greenlit. And, this experience that I had with Hulu, I was working on another movie, it was like, we're hitting year 5 and I'm like, it's not getting made. And then this movie kind of came in totally out of left field. And they were like, do you want to make a short film for Hulu? Do you want to pitch? And I was like, yeah, sure. And I pitched like 5 ideas, and they picked Appendage as a short film to make, which is something that I guess you normally wouldn't get to do. And that's a streaming specific opportunity. And so I did that, and they were like, we really like it. Do you want to make a feature? And I was like, nah, you're lying. Like, not possible, because I've been on this other project for 5 years and I don't see how this is going to happen. And they were like, no. Like, can you pitch it to us in like 3 weeks from now? We're like on a really tight timeline. And I was like, yeah. So I pulled something together really quickly. And then it went into production, 5 months later. It's the fastest timeline I've ever been a part of. And, you have to try to stay in your artistic zone when you're doing stuff like that. And for me, it was always about mental health. The movie was about, dealing with anxiety and depression and so many things, and trying to both make that disturbing, but also a little bit funny, and capture the sincerity of that experience. So that, I don't know if that would have been possible outside of streaming. The movie doesn't hit like, okay, like, what's the hook? What's the, it's like a weird freaking movie. And that was the purpose of it, was to be bizarre and weird. And it's very, very cool to see how many people it's reached on Hulu. And just the fan base that's grown in sort of like a cult type of way. And I don't know if that would have been possible theatrically. We have had a few screenings in theaters, and it's very cool to see people laughing and screaming and gasping. But it's also very cool to see how people digest it on their own on the internet. And so, I agree with you, Rebecca. It's like there's a lot of positives to streaming as well, where you can kind of really process something on your own and privately, and maybe not be influenced by the people around you, but it's kind of a party when you go out. So there's, pluses and minuses.
Well, as someone who is actually a total scaredy cat, and it's my spouse who loves horror and is always trying to get us to watch horror films. I think that I'm much likelier to relent to watching something that's scary at home, so that I can have my outsized response or what have you. Because also, like, I've paid many times to see films like the Others or The Woman in Black or what have you, and just basically spent my entire time in the movie theater covering my eyes. So so it's sort of like, I don't know if that's really worth the investment in the movie ticket. But we do have some audience questions that have come in, and it's sort of a slight shift from horror movies to Halloween and how they're intertwined together. Look, it is Halloween today, right? And Cami asks that more and more schools around the nation are halting Halloween celebrations for various concerns, including, putting people and families through unintentional financial or social pressure. There's some concern also about, potentially offensive outfits. There's also, kind of almost a kind of resurgence of different religious puritanisms or what have you, or just because it's too scary. So, and some cities have even banned teens from trick-or-treating. So Cami asks, do you think that Halloween is on the decline? And she says, what do you think, or they say, what do you think of the future of my favorite communal creative holiday? Will it be around in 50 years?
100%. It will be around, because even, this is like the further bifurcation of America here is kind of what it's boiling down to, because while part of the country is getting worried, and it's all within book banning as well, another part of the country, Halloween is big business. Like, the amount of money that people are spending just kind of economically on costumes, on decor, on decorations. You know, there's a reason that we, within the last 10 years, have seen the Halloween section at Lowe's, at Target expand and get huge. Like there's a reason people buy $300, 12-foot skeletons and things like that. Now I want one of those, by the way. But it's Halloween is a big business. And the reason is because there is so many people now who have made it an adult holiday as well. When I was a kid in the 80s and early 90s, it was still very much like a kid's holiday. There was not a lot of adult decorations. People weren't decking their houses out. That's completely changed now. I live in the middle of Burbank and every other house is like fully done out. So Halloween has financially become a huge thing because people are willing to pay for it, even if another part of the country is not. So yeah, it's gonna lead to, being more, kind of divided in that sense, but I don't see it as going anywhere. If anything, it has increased within the last decade and become a much more kind of generational celebration, not just reserved for kids.
Right.
I think,
Well, David asked
the comparison with,
go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. I was going to
go
say,
ahead. If you want to go ahead, chime in.
I think the comparison with book banning is very apt in that way. And it's, because it's part of, again, a kind of cultural moment that we're in, that in the most general way is about, the excessive coddling of kids. The idea that kids have to be defended against everything. And that, something that's going to bother them, according to the parents who think it will bother them, has to be banned or has to be made illegal or whatever it is. Of course, part of growing up back then, we were talking about, when you were in the 80s and 90s when it was a kid thing. I mean, it was part of it, it was part of the experience. Being scared was part of the experience, just like watching a horror movie. Being scared was part of the experience, and being able to overcome that or somehow bring that into your sense of self and not run away from it.
Anna, I actually have a question for you from, it's sort of related to something you said when you said you wanted to make something that was also funny when you made Appendage, that had a kind of strange sense of humor. And David asks, do you have any thoughts about the comedy horror mashup? It seems like more and more horror films have a sort of tongue-in-cheek quality. And so, obviously, you're into it, but say a little bit more about that. And any of you, of course, are invited to chime in with particularly good examples of this.
I think horror and comedy are the only two genres where you have to really craft something to get an audible response from an audience. And so to me, they're like sister genres and they go together very, very nicely. And I think, when you are dealing with heavy material, dark themes, it is really nice to have a bit of comedic relief. And whether that's like in a couple moments, even Talk to Me, like I just rewatched it this morning and there's like a ringtone that's like, ding, ding, ding. It's like the Minions thing. And I was like, that is so funny. It's like a little piece of something that alleviates a very, very heavy film. But I also think it's great when horror comedies are straight horror comedies and, they make you laugh all the way through and then they kind of come out of left field and scare you. And, it's a genre that I'm just now kind of, learning to love even more. And I think Jennifer's Body was the first one that I saw where I was like, this is freaking awesome. Like they're tapping into something really real and very scary, but then I get to laugh and kind of have fun while we're doing it. And I also think, because of that, maybe it's judged a little more harshly because I think adding comedy can kind of make it less pretentious. And sometimes people are like, that is not, they're not into that. And I think it kind of makes it more commercial in a weird way. I mean, to me, at least, to my palate.
Yeah, I'll continue with that and say, first, horror comedies are my fave. That's like my fave subgenre across the board. But for studios, they are a really hard sell. It is really hard to get something that is kind of an obvious horror comedy off the ground right now. Because you think about it, like scares are something that kind of transcend cultures. Like, a spider jumps out at you. It's scary in America. It's scary in the Middle East. It's scary in South America. It's scary all over. Humor is not. And so if you're looking at a big film that you want to take on a global market, the idea of mixing humor into the scares becomes a really difficult thing. And so studios are really hesitant to move forward with them a lot of the time. Like humor and horror in general is just a tough sell. We are seeing it happen on the streamers though. And as long as things are being successful on Hulu or Amazon, I'm hoping that the studios will kind of, follow along with it. But what you do as a filmmaker, if you are shopping around something that is a horror comedy, you don't put the comedy word in because that will freak out the studios, but instead you offer tonal cops. You say it's like Ready or Not, which, is, I look at that and I'm like, it's a horror comedy. It's got great dark humor in it, but from a studio standpoint, it was still scary enough that they could sell it. And so that's it's a weird, hard thing to describe humor mixed with scares on a studio level.
Right.
Well, of course you have, films like Young Frankenstein, say, which managed to do this in a very brilliant way. And I would say, even like the Rocky Horror Picture Show too, which is, again, it's scary, but it's a scary situation. And both of them are playing with horror motifs. And, part of the humor comes with that playing with it, that it's both serious, it is a horror motif, it is something scary. I mean, even the Scream movies are doing very similar things with it. So it's the self-consciousness about what it means to have a horror film. What are the beats in a horror film that everybody knows, and then to play around with them in that way. I think that's often very appealing. And Rocky Horror I always find fascinating, just because it's such a communal experience there.
Yeah.
And it connects to the audience so markedly.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like, Happy Death Day was another great, franchisable horror comedy. I think Chris Landon does such a great job with those. And Freaky,
Yes.
I mean, they do well and they do well.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just saw Fall of the House of Usher, which was Mike Flanagan's series on Netflix currently. I mean, for various reasons, obviously, also as a literature professor, right? So, but there's definitely a lot of humor, dark humor in that, along with the kind of thrill of the intertextual references and what have you, which a lot of horror has as well. Sienna asked a question about something that we discussed a little bit earlier about navigating the line between inviting viewers to identify with transgressive portrayals of otherness, or to kind of perpetuate the social othering by villainizing or re-victimizing certain marginalized characters. In what ways have you seen that in either direction? Maybe bring in an example of one or the other, if not both.
I'll kick off by saying some of my favorite horror films are the ones where it blends them. If you think about, I feel like Pearl's a really good example from a couple of years ago, where we are following her around as our protagonist. We are on her side. She is the main person that we are following. We are meant to side with Pearl emotionally and connect with her, but at the same time, she's also the monster. She's also the evil, the villain in the story. And so I always find it really fascinating when they get combined. I feel like American Psycho does that. It's a hard thing to do properly, but when you do it, it really kind of leads to this amazing confliction within the viewer.
Well, and of course, Hitchcock's Psycho, again, is the kind of progenitor of this as well. To follow what seems to be the protagonist, who then gets killed, partway through the movie, and then the person who seems to be, a totally nebbishy person turns out to be the killer. So, I mean, those kinds of Jekyll and Hyde reversals, I think, are part of that genre.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. And, as a creator who's interested in characters like that, this is it's a great question. And I think about it a lot. And I do agree that mixing the two is, the best way to go in a lot of ways. Because I think you honor the strangeness by also showing some of the pain, but then you're always in that character's POV and always, this is the side that we're on. And I think it's really important as a filmmaker to remember that with each scene, this is our hero. They're going through pain, but this is our hero and we have to stay on board with them. And just balancing those elements is just something that has to always be on your mind, I think.
Well, we've talked a lot about different moments where I think that we've seen the originality of horror emerge in various ways, but we did get an audience question, though, about repetition and the kind of reiteration that we get, that's not attributed to a specific asker of the question, but they ask, why is there a draw for not just remakes, but iterating this similar themes with the same monsters, threats, etc.? How do franchises or sequels fit in with the idea of horror as purgative or cathartic? So, it's not just in horror, of course. We do kind of live in an intellectual property world where like the reboot reigns king, but horror in and of itself, I don't even know how many Friday the 13th we have or Halloweens we have at this point, right? Like, what is it about wanting to revisit the same monster, that same figure over and over again?
It's
Well,
not, go ahead, Leo. I'll jump in a sec.
Sure. Okay. I would, I think it's not so much about it is revisiting, and it's sort of something that we mentioned, I think of, a while ago. That is, in terms of the fears that horror raises there, once the monster is killed or the horror is over with, that doesn't mean it's over with. You win the battle. You're always winning the battle, but you never win the war. And so the whole idea, and horror, I think, particularly of all genres, and of course, all genres do this. Rom-coms do it, comedies do it. They're always playing on past versions of themselves. But horror, perhaps even more than the rest does, because in fact, it wants to raise the kind of fears that are innate in human nature and deal with them in one way or another, and finally come to an end. The end appears on the screen, but the end does not appear inside the self. You have to do it again and again. And I think, people who are attracted to different kinds of franchises, different kinds of horror movies, again, want to go through that process again and again. It's sort of like, being tough, taking the risk, going to the edge. How many times am I going to go to the edge and still be saved? I'm going to watch another horror movie.
Yeah, viewers in general, we tend to find something that we like and kind of just keep watching different versions of it. It's the model behind Lifetime. It's the model behind Hallmark. Like all of those movies, it's the model behind murder documentaries. Like they all kind of have the same formula and function the same. So it's not just limited to horror. It's if you like romantic comedies, they all follow that same pattern. With horror, we even go deeper and divide it into subgenres of, I tend to like slashers, or I tend to like body horrors. And then again, they are haunted house movies. They follow that same pattern. And so we do tend to kind of say like, this is the type of pattern that I like to follow, but then it's all about what the filmmaker does to kind of mix it up or make it more interesting. Franchises and reboots, they'll run in kind of a cyclical nature of whether Hollywood is gravitating towards those or whether they're looking for new IP. Right now, specifically this year, has been all about IP reboots and franchises. Like if we look at the major films that did theatrical, it's like Five Nights at Freddy's, Evil Dead, Saw, Scream, The Exorcist, Insidious. Like these are all based on prior IP. And a lot of that is because they're relatively low risk for studios. If you're going to put a huge amount of money into something and it's Scream, well, the marketing's kind of already done for it because you don't have to sell a whole new concept to an audience. You just have to smack Ghostface on the poster and we'll all turn up in droves, anybody who's ever liked a Scream film before. So the IP reboots are always going to be a lower risk, and those become kind of the studio tentpole movies because they know it's going to make money just because Ghostface is in it every single time. So they're such a huge part of the horror landscape and always will be in some degree.
Yeah, it's super interesting, from like an artist perspective. I have a lot of pitches and a lot of meetings, and they're always like, okay, but like if you have any IP you like, let us know. I was like, okay.
Every pitch meeting right now.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because I get it that it's lower risk, and aside from even tentpole films, I think that's happening even with like 5 million and under movies. They're like, well, is it based on a short story? Is it a book? Is it an article? And I think it just makes studios feel safer and producers feel safer to have a built-in fan base. And I'm kind of excited about some original ideas and, original IP. And I hope that some of that stuff starts getting made, and maybe streamers are the place, to do it.
So James asks us a question about our favorite go-to horror movies, specifically on Halloween. But before I ask each of you this, I'm going to tell you all a story of something that happened to me on Halloween once, when my wife and I decided to watch Halloween on Halloween at home. And, it's creepy. Mike Myers, sort of like the figure in the window. I wake up to the sound of my partner jostling me in bed saying, "Help, look, oh my God." And there was a figure backlit in the window. And I screamed. The very first thing I screamed was, "What are you doing here? Are you real?" Because it just sort of was like in that liminal space between waking life and what have you. So I do have to say that the original Halloween remains the scariest film for me because that happened. And it turned out that this person, I think, just wandered from a Halloween party on Sunset Boulevard, like into our neighborhood and ended up in our backyard somehow and really creeped us out. But he also came to the front door and poked his head in like this little kind of Spanish door inlet and said, "Let me in. I come here all the time," which also I think that's only something a ghost says, right? I sort of felt like I was living in the realm of the supernatural, in the liminal. In any case, that's why Halloween for me remains the scariest film, in part because of what happened there. But do you all have any examples of your go-to Halloween films as we close out, or a scary thing that happened in relation to watching a horror film?
I would say that, I love Halloween in that way too. And I love it particularly, just because it puts you in the position of the killer so much. They hear that breathing on the soundtrack. I mean, that is almost scarier than any of the slaughter that goes on. That somehow that breathing, you're breathing, that killer is breathing. And it's, that itself, that identification, I think it just drags you right into the film, and it's really hard to forget.
Yeah.
Yeah. Halloween watches for me. So when I'm thinking about like what I want to watch on Halloween, I always want something that's fun, something that feels like it's moving. And I always want it set on Halloween and to kind of create the idyllic Halloween atmosphere for me. So from my childhood, Monster Squad is one where it is this kind of just celebration of monster loving kids, of being the other. It's set on Halloween night, so you feel that kind of infused in. And then again, these are kind of personal tastes, but Trick or Treat and Trick or Treat, two vastly different films. Trick or Treat being this like bonkers 81 that's like a killer heavy metal slasher ghost. It's really fun. And then Trick or Treat being a more recent one, anthology film that is just a celebration of the genre in general. And I'll give one deep cut. Lady in White is a 1980s ghost film set on Halloween. It's kind of in this bucolic little, it feels like Maine town, that it's a good, tight little ghost story that I always think of as like a tight little Halloween, genuinely scary movie.
I think I'm going to be watching The Conjuring tonight, because that movie actually genuinely scares me. And no matter how many times I watch it, I'm always scared. So I'm gonna get into a genuinely scary zone tonight and do that. I also have a scary story to share. In college, my freshman year at USC, I was watching The Exorcist with my roommate, and we had just made smoothies in like the common area. And we were like, "Yeah, oh my God, we're gonna watch The Exorcist, woo!" And it was like Halloween, or around Halloween, and we left the blender on the common room table. And, you're living in a dorm, you leave the door open, it's chill. And so we go into her room and we're watching The Exorcist and we're eating popcorn and drinking our smoothies and like having a great time. And like 10 minutes go by and I'm like, you know what? I need to go to the bathroom. Hold on. And so I go to the bathroom and the blender has moved off the table onto the floor, and it's just on the floor. Why? We don't know. No one else was there. And we went around asking the entire dorm if anybody had come in and moved our blender. I'm sure somebody came in and moved our blender. But to this day, we're like, definitely an evil spirit that was conjured by watching The Exorcist. So that's my story there.
You don't want to share in which dorm, do you? As for our audience here.
The Arts and Humanities dorm, Parkside. So Parkside people, be wary.
Watch out tonight, Parkside people. Well, we have a couple of minutes left, and I just want to make sure that each of you get your parting scary thoughts out to our audience before we go. If there was one thing that you want to convey to people about the experience of horror as a genre, or in thinking about it, what's your big takeaway for folks today? Like, what do you want them to remember about this, about horror, when they decide to either try to re-encounter it or look at it anew after our discussion today? Leo, I'll start with you.
Well, I think, part of the discussion is interesting because we're talking about the horror films and horror literature and horror situations, horror paintings, whatever, in the way as academics as we do, which allows us to stand back a little bit from the feelings that, in fact, these works evoke in us too. And I think, just being able to understand how essential horror is, in fact, to our views of the world. I mean, horror, I think it was mentioned early on when we were talking about it, horror and religion, I think you mentioned, Karen, are very closely connected in that way. And depending on what your religious background is, it modifies your view of horror. And, these are really essential feelings that you have that are, part of your character there too. And, by the same token, in a more general way, I mean, what horror is about is that odd and peculiar and ambiguous line between what's alive and what's dead, what's here and what's absent there. So it requires, it is a way to as religion, and they're like twins almost. It's a way of trying to understand the mysteries of the world and the mysteries of character. So that's really its lure for me, and I think it's continues to be fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Anna.
Yes. Yeah, kind of along the same lines, I think that we spend a lot of time as humans trying to avoid feeling bad or scared or just uncomfortable. And I think, Leo, you mentioned this earlier, it's kind of essential to feel those things and to learn how to process them and incorporate them into your life. And I think horror can be spiritual in that way, where you're like, oh, I'm allowed in this hour and a half to feel insane and scared and bad and good and all the things. And, I think if you're a person who's going to reopen the door to horror, that might be a nice way to look at it, where it's like, oh, I can kind of put some of my bad feelings in here and then feel good after, and use that as like a processing tool.
Rebecca.
Yeah, continuing with that, there are now studies, books, entire documentaries that link horror films to mental health, that for a lot of people, that it does have this incredibly positive effect, that, when you're looking for a way to deal with stress, to deal with emotions, to deal with personal trauma, that there is, you can go punch something, some people are going to go, do another hobby. And for some people, they can excise mental demons through horror films, that it is a way to kind of come to terms with things, or at least lose yourself for a little bit and process what's going on. And I'd also like to say that it doesn't need to be something that you do one day a year, that it is perfectly acceptable and okay to decide that, you're in the mood for a horror film in April, and that it is still there for you, and that there is something for everybody.
Well, you all have convinced me to reevaluate my own very averse relationship to horror as a genre, and to appreciate it anew for all of the work that it accomplishes in our culture, in our lives, with our mental health, and with the way we relate to others. So I want to wish everyone here at USC Dornsife a happy Halloween once more, and to thank our panelists, Leo Brody, Rebecca McKendry, and Anna Zlokovich. Have a wonderful day, and thank you all.